The call came at 2:17 a.m., a shrill digital scream that sliced through the quiet hum of my apartment's radiator. It was the sound of death, or at least, its aftermath. For a crime scene photographer, sleep is a luxury rented between tragedies. I swung my legs out of bed, the cold Chicago floorboards a familiar shock to the system. Outside, the wind howled off Lake Michigan, rattling the window panes of my third-floor walk-up in Pilsen. It was a brutal February night, the kind that seeps into your bones. "Leo," I answered, my voice a gravelly mess. "Got one for you," said the gruff voice of Sergeant Miller from dispatch. "Lincoln Park, high-rise on Clark, Detective Flores is lead. Says she wants you, specifically. On my way." I didn't ask for details. They never gave them over the phone, and I didn't need them. The story would be waiting for me, written in blood spatter and disarray. I moved with a practiced efficiency, a somber ritual. Black cargo pants, black thermal shirt, sturdy boots. My gear was already packed in the trunk of my beat-up Ford Explorer. Canons, lenses for every conceivable shot, tripods, portable lighting, and the small, waterproof case for my memory cards. Each piece of equipment was an extension of my eye, a tool to capture the silent, brutal truth of a moment. The drive north was a blur of sodium streetlights, reflecting off slushy, half-frozen streets. Chicago at this hour was a ghost town of skeletal trees and darkened storefronts. I sipped lukewarm coffee from a thermos, the bitter taste grounding me. I liked working with Detective Isabella Flores. She was sharp, respected the process, and understood that my photographs were not just procedural requirements. They were the immutable witnesses that never forgot a detail. She didn't rush me, she let me work. The high-rise was a stark monolith of glass and steel, a beacon of wealth against the oppressive night sky. Squad cars painted the entrance in strobing reds and blues. I badged my way past the rookie officer guarding the yellow tape, my presence expected. The elevator ride to the 24th floor was silent, save for the mechanical whir. My reflection in the polished brass doors looked tired, the lines around my eyes deeper than they were a year ago. It's a job that ages you in dog years. The apartment door was ajar, splintered near the lock. Inside, the air was thick with the coppery tang of blood, and something else, a faint, floral perfume that felt tragically out of place. Flores met me just inside the foyer. She had a styrofoam cup of coffee in her hand, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her gaze was as sharp and cold as the winter wind. "Leo, thanks for coming," she said, her voice low. "It's not pretty." They rarely are, Izzy. Victim's a male, late 40s. Looks like a robbery gone sideways. We're still waiting on ID. Landlord says the tenant is a Richard Crane, but we can't be sure until the ME confirms. She gestured deeper into the apartment. "It's all yours. The scene is secure. Forensics is just finishing their initial sweep." I nodded, unzipping my main gear bag. The apartment was immaculate, betraying a meticulous owner. White leather couches, a glass coffee table, abstract art on the walls. The orderliness of the living space made the chaos in the master bedroom all the more jarring. That's where he was. He was on the floor, between the king-sized bed and a large bay window that overlooked the glittering, indifferent city. He lay on his back, dressed in silk pajamas, a pool of dark blood haloing his head. The cause of death seemed obvious, blunt force trauma. A heavy, ornate lamp lay on its side nearby, its base stained. My work began. It was a dance I knew by heart. First, the establishing shots. I stood at the doorway of the bedroom, my wide-angle lens capturing the entire scene, the relationship between the body and the room. I took shots from all four corners, creating a comprehensive map. The yellow evidence markers placed by forensics were small islands in a sea of tragedy. Marker number 1, the lamp. Marker number 2, a knocked-over glass on the nightstand. Marker number 3, a drawer pulled open, its contents strewn about. Next, the mid-range shots, moving closer, focusing on the evidence markers and their proximity to the victim. Every angle mattered. Every shadow held a potential secret. I worked methodically, my camera's shutter the only sound I allowed myself to hear, a rhythmic click-click-click that walled off the horror. This was my defense mechanism, to see the scene not as a human tragedy, but as a collection of planes, angles, and light. Finally, the close-ups. This was the hardest part. This was where the victim ceased to be a shape in the room and became a person. I documented the wounds with a clinical detachment using a macro lens. The defensive wounds on his forearms, the contusion on his temple, and his face, frozen in a mask of surprise and pain. I took a sequence of shots of his hands. His left hand was flung out to his side, palm up, fingers slightly curled as if reaching for something that wasn't there. I finished with the rest of the apartment, documenting the point of entry and any other signs of disturbance. An hour and 274 photographs later, I was done. I gave Flores a nod. "You'll have them by morning." "Good work, Leo," she said, not looking up from her notes. Back in my apartment, the city was still asleep. The radiator hissed a lonely tune. I didn't bother trying to sleep. The images were always too loud in my head right after a scene. I slotted the memory card into my computer, the ritual of processing the photos, a way to decompress. I began the upload to the secure server for the department, but first, I did my own review, flagging the key shots for Flores's report. I clicked through the images, my eyes scanning for focus, lighting, and detail. Establishing shots, clear. Mid-range, good context. Then I got to the close-ups of the victim. I pulled up IMG 7834, a shot of his left hand and the floor around it. Then I clicked to IMG 7841, a slightly different angle of the same hand, taken perhaps 90 seconds later after I had adjusted my lighting. I froze. My coffee cup paused halfway to my lips. Something was wrong. I toggled back and forth between the two images. IMG 7834. The victim's index finger was slightly curled, the nail barely touching the polished hardwood floor. IMG 7841. The finger was now straighter. The tip was pressed flat against the wood. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. It was a minuscule difference. A millimeter, maybe two. The kind of thing anyone else would miss, but I don't miss things. My entire career, my life, was built on not missing things. I quickly cross-referenced the time stamps, 1 minute and 37 seconds apart. During that time, I was the only one near the body. Forensics had finished their work in that area. I hadn't touched him. No one had. I zoomed in, my screen pixelating. The change was undeniable. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't a different angle creating an illusion. The finger had moved. And in the silent, cold stillness of that room, that was impossible. The first wave was disbelief, cold and immediate. It washed over Leo, tightening his chest and making the stale air in his apartment feel thin. It was 3 a.m. The only light came from the dual monitors on his desk, casting a clinical glow on his face. Outside, the sounds of Chicago had softened to a distant, rhythmic hum, a city breathing in its sleep. He pushed his chair back, the wheels groaning in protest, and ran a hand over his face, the stubble rasping against his palm. "No," he whispered to the empty room. "No way. Fatigue. It had to be. Long hours, the grim nature of the work. It wore you down, played tricks on your eyes." He'd been at that scene in Lincoln Park for nearly 6 hours, a sensory overload of muted tragedy and methodical procedure. He had shot over 400 photographs. It was entirely possible, even probable, that his brain was just short-circuiting. He leaned forward again, his focus narrowing back to the two images side by side on his primary monitor, IMG 73 41.jpg and IMG 73 42.jpg. The victim's right hand, resting on the dark mahogany of the bedroom floor. In the first photo, the index finger was slightly curled, the nail barely grazing a faint scratch in the wood finish. In the second, taken exactly 97 seconds later, according to the EXIF data, the fingertip was now covering that scratch completely. A shift of maybe 2 millimeters, infinitesimal and impossible. His training, his entire professional ethos, screamed for a logical explanation. He started with himself. Camera shake, No, the images were tack-sharp, shot on a tripod with a remote shutter release. The metadata confirmed it, 1/60th of a second f/8 ISO 400. Rock solid. He zoomed in to 300%. The wood grain, the pores on the victim's skin, the tiny fibers from the carpet, all perfectly in focus. It wasn't the camera, a draft. He remembered the apartment being sealed and stuffy, the air heavy and still. The windows were closed and locked. The HVAC system had been turned off by the initial officers on scene to preserve evidence, standard procedure. Nothing in the room was light enough to have been moved by a phantom breeze, let alone a dead man's finger. His mind raced, cycling through a Rolodex of debunking theories. A tremor. Chicago wasn't earthquake country, but buildings settled. The nearby L train could cause vibrations, but this was a modern high-rise, built on a solid foundation far from the tracks. And even if there had been a tremor, other objects would have shifted. He began a frantic, systematic review. He pulled up the wider shots of the bedroom taken before and after the close-ups of the hand. The overturned lamp on the nightstand, unchanged, the scattered papers near the desk, identical, the faint pattern of dust on the floor, undisturbed. Everything was exactly as he had left it, frozen in time. Everything except that one finger. He opened his editing software and created a new file, layering IMG 7341 over IMG 7342. He set the top layer's opacity to 50%. The two images merged into a ghostly composite. Every detail aligned perfectly. The knuckles, the veins, the texture of the floor, except for the tip of the index finger, which created a blurry, telltale halo of movement. It was undeniable. It was real. A different kind of coldness began to seep into him now, a dread that had nothing to do with tiredness. This wasn't a trick of the light or a flaw in his technique. This was a data point that didn't fit, a variable he couldn't account for. And in his line of work, unaccountable variables were terrifying. They meant you missed something. They meant you failed. His thoughts immediately went to Detective Izzy Flores. He could picture her reaction perfectly. Her sharp, intelligent eyes would narrow. She'd take a slow sip of her ever-present cold brew coffee, her expression a careful mask of impatient professionalism. "Let me get this straight, Leo," he could hear her saying, her voice laced with that dry, North Side skepticism. "You're telling me our victim, who the ME pronounced dead at the scene with a clear time of death hours before you even arrived, moved his finger. Are you feeling okay?" He'd be a laughingstock. His reputation, built over a decade of meticulous, unassailable work, would be shattered by a single, insane observation. He'd be the spooky photographer, the guy who sees ghosts in his pictures. Every case he worked from that point on would be viewed through a lens of doubt. Flores might even request a different photographer. The thought sent a jolt of pure professional terror through him. So, what was the alternative? Delete the photos. Erase IMG 7342 and pretend it never existed. No one would ever know. His sequence would be intact, his report clean. It was just a 2mm shift. It couldn't possibly be relevant to a blunt force trauma homicide. It was a freak occurrence, a post-mortem twitch, a rigor mortis anomaly that no textbook had ever documented. It was noise, not signal. He could ignore it, he should ignore it, but he knew he couldn't. It would be a lie of omission, a deliberate corruption of the record. He was a photographer, a documentarian. His job was to capture the truth of a scene, no matter how inconvenient or bizarre. That finger was part of the truth. Hiding it would be a betrayal of everything he stood for. It would be worse than being laughed at. It would be a compromise of his own integrity, a stain that only he would see but would never be able to wash away. He stared at the screen, the two photos a testament to his impossible dilemma. The city outside remained indifferent. The hum of his computer was the only sound accompanying the frantic beating of his own heart. He thought about the victim, a man named Marcus Thorne, whose life had ended violently in that sterile, expensive apartment. Did he deserve to have this last, strange detail of his existence erased because a photographer was afraid of looking foolish. Leo minimized the photo comparison window. He opened his contacts and scrolled down to F. Flores, Izzy. Her number glowed on the screen. His thumb hovered over the call icon, a millimeter away from making the most difficult decision of his career. To report the impossible and risk everything, or to stay silent and live with the lie. The weight of those 97 seconds pressed down on him, heavier than any body he had ever photographed. The digital clock on my monitor glowed 2:17 a.m. Outside, Chicago was a distant, muted hum, a beast sleeping with one eye open. Inside my apartment, the only sound was the frantic thumping of my own heart against my ribs. My index finger, the one hovering over Detective Flores's contact on my phone, felt impossibly heavy. Every instinct, every ounce of self-preservation screamed at me to close the laptop, delete the image overlays, and pretend the last hour never happened. Go to sleep. Forget the impossible flicker of movement. My job was to document, not to interpret, and certainly not to hallucinate, but I couldn't. The image was burned onto the back of my eyelids. The two frames, side by side, the undeniable shift in the victim's finger. It was a tiny, insignificant detail in the grand, bloody tapestry of the scene, yet it had unraveled my entire sense of reality. Ignoring it felt like a betrayal, not just of my professional code, but of something deeper, something tied to the very reason I chose this job, to give a voice to the silent, to ensure the truth, in all its grim detail, was preserved. My thumb pressed down. The screen lit up with her name, and the electronic ringtone sliced through the silence of the room. It sounded unnaturally loud, a siren announcing my career suicide. 1 ring. 2. My throat was dry. What was I even going to say? "Hi, detective, sorry to wake you, but I think our dead guy isn't quite behaving like he should." "Flores," her voice crackled, thick with sleep and instant annoyance. It was the voice of a woman who was never truly off duty, but hated being reminded of it. "Detective, it's Leo Martinez. I am so sorry to call this late." My own voice was strained, a stranger's voice. There was a rustle of sheets, a muffled curse. "Martinez, what's wrong? Is there a problem with the file transfer?" "No, the transfer is fine. Everything's uploaded. It's something in the photos themselves. From the scene tonight. On North Damon." A weary sigh traveled through the phone. "Leo, unless the victim sat up and confessed, this can wait until morning." My stomach twisted. This was it, the point of no return. "I found a discrepancy," I said, choosing the word carefully. It sounded clinical, professional, safe, in the sequential shots of the victim. "A discrepancy," she repeated, her tone sharpening with impatience. "Like a lens flare, a shadow you can't identify. Spit it out, Leo." I took a breath, the stale air of my apartment filling my lungs. "There's movement," I said, the word landing with a thud in the space between us. "In the photos, the victim." Silence. For a long, drawn-out moment, I thought she'd hung up. I could picture her perfectly. Sitting up in bed, rubbing the exhaustion from her eyes, the ambient glow of a street lamp painting stripes across her bedroom wall. "Movement," she finally said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Leo, the M. E pronounced him on sight. I saw the report. What exactly are you telling me?" "Frames 3 billion-74 and 3 billion-75, I said, forcing myself to stick to the facts, to the data. They were taken 97 seconds apart. It was after the initial sweep, before the ME's team started their work. Nobody else was near the body. In frame 74, the victim's left index finger is resting against his middle finger. In frame 75, it's shifted. It's moved apart maybe a quarter of an inch. Another heavy pause. I could hear the faint sound of a siren in the background of her call, a classic Chicago lullaby. "A quarter of an inch," she repeated, her voice laced with a thick, syrupy disbelief. "Let me get this straight. You're calling me at 2 in the morning to tell me a dead man's finger moved a quarter of an inch?" "I know how it sounds," I said quickly, my desperation rising. "Believe me, I've spent the last 2 hours trying to debunk it." I checked the tripod logs, rock steady. I checked for vibrations, camera glitches, lens distortion. I overlaid the images. It's not an illusion, it's real. The finger moved. A rat, she said dismissively. Building settling, a breeze from a vent. There are 100 logical explanations, Leo. The windows were sealed, the HVAC was off. Izzy, I pleaded, switching to her first name, a gamble on our years of professional history. The scene was static. Nothing else was disturbed, not a speck of dust. You know my work, you know I don't miss things, and you know I don't invent them. I heard her take a deep, ragged breath. It was the sound of a patient person reaching the absolute limit of their patience. Leo, have you been sleeping? This job, it gets to you. We see things, our brains play tricks on us. You've been staring at a screen for hours. This isn't in my brain, I insisted, my voice gaining a hard edge. It's in the data. It's in the goddamn metadata. 2 pictures, 97 seconds, a definite change, that's a fact. I can't explain it, and it's my job to document, but this is a detail that wasn't there, and then it was. That feels important. The line went quiet again, but this time it felt different. It was the sound of her thinking, not just dismissing. I had leveraged the only thing I had, my reputation for being meticulous to the point of obsession. The man who documents, who never interprets, was now presenting an impossible interpretation. All right, she said finally, her voice low and graveled. You've woken me up. You've said your piece. What do you want me to do, Leo? Reopen the crime scene because of a twitch? I don't know, I admitted, the fight draining out of me, replaced by a hollow ache. I could not report it. It felt wrong. It's a break in the record, my record. Another sigh, this one carrying the weight of the entire city's crime rate. Fine, you reported it. It's on the record now. I'll call the ME's office in the morning. I'll have them take another look at the body, specifically the left hand, see if they notice anything unusual. Are you happy? I'm not happy, Izzy. I think I'm losing my mind, I confessed in a near whisper. Her tone softened almost imperceptibly. You're not losing your mind, Leo. You're overworked. We all are. Go to bed. Get some sleep. Don't look at the photos again tonight. That's an order. Okay, I agreed, though we both knew I wouldn't be able to sleep. I'll call you tomorrow if the ME finds anything, but I'm telling you now, they won't. Good night, Martinez. She hung up before I could reply. The silence that rushed back in was heavier than before. I was alone again with the 2 glowing images on my screen. I had done it. I had reported the impossible. And just as I had feared, I was professionally adrift, my credibility hanging by the thread of a veteran detective's fleeting patience. Flores was placating me, humoring the guy who finally cracked. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that her call to the medical examiner would be a token gesture. If I wanted answers, I wouldn't get them from the department. I would have to find them myself. The pale Chicago dawn did little to cut through the gloom that had settled in Leo's apartment. Sleep had been a foreign country he couldn't get a visa for. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the 2 images of the victim's hand, the 97-second gap, the infinitesimal but undeniable shift. Flores's voice, thick with condescension and fatigue, echoed in his ears. A rat, building settling. She wasn't just dismissing him, she was dismissing his entire professional ethos. For 12 years, his job had been to see what others missed, to document reality with unflinching accuracy. Now, that very reality had become a question, and he was completely alone in asking it. He poured the last of the stale coffee into a mug, the bitter taste a fitting companion to his thoughts. The ME's office would do exactly what Flores asked. A cursory glance, a box checked, a report filed that said nothing unusual noted. The system was designed to process bodies, not paradoxes. If he wanted an answer, the system wasn't going to provide it. Flipping open his department-issued laptop, Leo navigated to the internal case management portal. His credentials gave him access to the files he worked on, a digital extension of the crime scenes he photographed. Usually, he'd only pull up a case to cross-reference a photo log or confirm a detail for his report. This time felt different. It felt like a transgression. He was no longer a photographer. He was something else, something he wasn't qualified to be. He typed in the case number, 7741B. The file opened, a sterile collection of preliminary data. Victim, John Doe. Apparent cause of death, single gunshot wound to the chest. Motive, suspected robbery. But buried in the supplementary reports was a new entry from the morgue's intake. The victim's prints had been run through the system. A match had been found. The John Doe now had a name, Arthur Finch, age 58. Leo stared at the name, Arthur Finch. It was an old-fashioned name, a name that felt out of place in a glass and steel high-rise. He kept reading. Address, a walk-up apartment in Ravenswood, a world away from the gleaming towers of the Loop where he died. Occupation, horologist and antique book restorer, a clockmaker and a bookmender. A man who dealt in the slow, patient mechanics of time and the preservation of decaying stories. It didn't fit. Robbery victims were often random, but this felt dissonant. Why was a man like Arthur Finch in a corporate apartment downtown, a place that reeked of money and transient power? Leo copied the address. The official investigation would focus on the place of death. They would canvass the high-rise, check security footage, look for the killer. But the answer to why the impossible had happened, Leo felt, wasn't in the sterile corporate apartment where Finch died. It was in the place where he lived. An hour later, Leo was parked across the street from a 3-story brick building on a quiet, tree-lined street in Ravenswood. It was a classic Chicago apartment house, with ornate limestone details over the windows and a small, tidy patch of grass out front. It felt lived in, permanent. He got out of his car, his camera bag conspicuously left on the passenger seat. He wasn't here to take pictures. He adjusted his jacket, feeling the unfamiliar weight of the lie he was about to tell. He buzzed the building's superintendent. A moment later, a gruff voice crackled through the intercom. "Yeah. Hi, my name is Leo Vance," he said, his voice steadier than he expected. "I'm with the City Department of Property Reconciliation. I just need to verify some details regarding the police incident involving your tenant, Mr. Finch. It's just a final piece of paperwork for our records." It was a meaningless title he'd invented on the drive over, vague and bureaucratic enough to sound plausible. There was a pause. Leo could picture the man on the other end, debating whether this was worth his time. "Police already talked to me," the voice grumbled. "I understand, sir. This is a different department. We just handle the civic liability side of things. It'll only take 5 minutes. My supervisor will have my badge if I don't file the report today." The mention of a supervisor seemed to do the trick. A loud buzz unlocked the door. The superintendent, a man named Henderson with a tired face and grease-stained hands, was waiting in the lobby. He led Leo up to the 3rd floor. The hallway was quiet, smelling of floor polish and old wood. Apartment 3, Billion had a strip of yellow police tape stretched across the door, the official seal looking stark and violent in the otherwise peaceful corridor. "They sealed it up yesterday," Henderson said, gesturing with a thumb. "Told me not to let anyone in. You got authority for this." Leo pulled out his departmental ID. His photo stared back at him, identifying him as a forensic investigator. It was true, but not the whole truth. "My office works with CPD on these matters. I don't need to go inside for long, just need to lay eyes on the interior to confirm the state of the property for the report." Henderson grunted, satisfied. He used a master key to unlock the deadbolt, then carefully lifted the police tape and pushed the door open. "Don't touch nothing, that's what they told me." "Wouldn't dream of it," Leo said, stepping inside. The apartment was small, meticulously neat, and filled with a soft, natural light. It was the polar opposite of the crime scene. One wall was lined with bookshelves filled not just with books, but with the tools of Finch's trade. Small clamps, delicate brushes, pots of glue, and sheets of fine paper. A large workbench sat under the main window, covered with the guts of an old mantel clock, its brass gears gleaming. This was a place of quiet concentration. Nothing suggested violence or chaos. There were no signs of a struggle, no drawers pulled out. The police had already been through, of course, but the place retained the personality of its owner. It was the home of a man who lived a life of precision and order. Leo's eyes scanned the room, looking for anything that didn't belong. The police report mentioned no forced entry here. They believed the incident was contained to the downtown apartment. Leo walked slowly around the main room, his gaze falling on the workbench. He saw the clock parts, the bookbinding tools, and then something else. Tucked behind a magnifying lamp was a small, gray plastic box, no bigger than a deck of cards. It was clearly not an antique. Thin, multicolored wires emerged from one side, ending in tiny, needle-like electrodes. On its surface were two small dials, unmarked except for tiny, hand-scratched symbols. It looked like a custom-built piece of electronics, something from a hobbyist's kit. It felt profoundly out of place among the wood, brass, and paper of Finch's world. Next to it was a small, leather-bound notebook. Leo hesitated, Henderson's warning ringing in his ears. But he knew he wouldn't get another chance. Glancing at the doorway to ensure the superintendent hadn't followed him in, he carefully flipped it open. The pages were filled with neat, cramped handwriting and complex diagrams. He saw terms he didn't understand: myoelectric signal, peripheral nerve latency, transcutaneous stimulation patterns. On one page, Finch had sketched a detailed diagram of a human hand, with lines pointing to the ulnar and median nerves, annotated with voltage and frequency numbers. His heart hammered in his chest. This wasn't just a hobby. This was sophisticated, self-directed research into the human nervous system. This was a man trying to artificially stimulate his own nerves. Leo quickly and quietly snapped the notebook shut, his mind racing. A man who spent his life with the delicate mechanics of clocks and books was secretly experimenting with the delicate wiring of his own body. He didn't know what it meant, but it was a piece of the puzzle. It was the first tangible, physical thing that felt as strange as the photograph on his computer screen. He backed out of the apartment. "Everything seems in order," he said to Henderson, his voice betraying none of the turmoil inside him. "Thanks for your help." Walking back down the stairs and into the cool morning air, Leo felt the ground shift beneath him. He was no longer just a man with an impossible photograph. He was a man with a secret, a clue. Arthur Finch wasn't just a victim, he was a mystery, and Leo had just taken his first step into solving it alone. The cold Chicago air felt like a slap in the face as I stepped out of Finch's building, a stark contrast to the stale, quiet atmosphere of the dead man's apartment. I clutched the strap of my camera bag, the weight of Finch's notebook inside feeling heavier than any lens. I hadn't stolen evidence, I told myself. I had borrowed it. The distinction felt flimsy, a paper-thin shield against the felony I had just committed. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that seemed to echo in the deserted Ravenswood street. Driving back to my apartment, every pair of headlights in my rearview mirror felt like a threat. Was it Flores? Had she somehow figured out I'd gone rogue? It was pure paranoia, the product of a guilty conscience and too little sleep, but it was potent. Back in the sterile safety of my own space, I laid the notebook on my desk next to my laptop, which displayed the crisp, damning photos of the device. Looking at them side by side, the meticulous schematics and the cobbled-together reality, I felt a new wave of urgency. I had the what, but I had no idea how it worked or, more importantly, why it existed. Taking this to the CPD lab was impossible. It would mean confessing to breaking and entering, evidence tampering, and obstruction. My career would be over before the lab tech even powered it on. I needed an outside expert, someone with no ties to law enforcement, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions, and someone I could trust. The list was terrifyingly short. It contained a single name, one I hadn't thought of in almost a decade: Ben Carter. Ben and I had started in the same photography program at Columbia College. While I was obsessed with composition and light, Ben was obsessed with the guts of the machines. He'd spend hours taking apart light meters and camera bodies, fascinated by the circuits and wires. He'd eventually dropped out, dismissing the art form as just trapping light, and went off to chase his real passion, electronics. A quick search online, fueled by a desperate hope, brought me to a grainy photo of him, a little heavier, a little less hair, standing proudly in front of a cluttered storefront. Ben's Fix-It and Custom Builds. It was a small electronics repair shop over in Wicker Park. It was perfect. The next afternoon, I found the shop sandwiched between a vintage clothing store and a taco joint. A small bell chimed as I pushed the door open, announcing my arrival into a cave of technological chaos. Shelves overflowed with dissected laptops, tangled nests of cables, and antique radios. The air smelled of ozone, solder, and old coffee. Behind the counter, surrounded by a fortress of monitors and circuit boards, sat Ben. He looked up and a flicker of recognition crossed his face before morphing into surprise. Leo Kowalski? Holy hell, man, what are you doing here? He asked, standing up and wiping a greasy hand on his jeans before offering it. I shook it, a small smile breaking through my anxiety. Hey, Ben, long time. The internet said this was your place. Looks like you're doing all right. Yeah, I can't complain. People are always breaking their crap, he chuckled. What brings a hotshot police photographer to my humble abode? Don't tell me you broke your camera. I charge extra for the fancy ones. The casual mention of my job sent a jolt of caution through me. I needed to tread carefully. Something like that, I said, forcing a casual tone. It's more of a personal project. I stumbled onto something and thought of you. You were always the guy who knew what made things tick. His curiosity was piqued. Oh yeah. Lay it on me. I pulled out my laptop and opened the folder with the photos of Finch's device. I didn't show him the crime scene photos, just the tight shots of the box, the wires, and the electrodes. I slid it across the counter. Ben leaned in, his eyes scanning the images with an intensity I remembered from our college days. He zoomed in, then out, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then I placed the notebook on the counter, opened to one of the pages with the clearest schematics and the notes on nerve clusters in the hand. This came with it. Ben picked up the notebook, his fingers tracing the hand-drawn diagrams. He was silent for a full minute, flipping through the pages, his expression shifting from curiosity to a kind of technical reverence. Wow, he finally breathed out, looking from the notebook to the screen. Okay, this is not a personal project, Leo, unless your hobbies have gotten really weird. He tapped the screen. This is a custom-built TENS unit, a really, really sophisticated one. A TENS unit, like for back pain, the name was vaguely familiar. Sort of. TENS stands for transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation. Physical therapists use them to treat pain. They send little electrical pulses through the skin to the nerves underneath, he explained, his excitement growing. But the commercial ones are toys compared to this. Look at this. He pointed to a component in the photo. That's a precision waveform generator tied to a programmable microcontroller. And this transformer, he stepped up the voltage, but the amperage is microcontrolled. This isn't for dulling pain. This is for control, for targeted muscle activation. He flipped back to the diagram of the human hand in the notebook. See this? He's mapped out the median and ulnar nerves. He's not just shocking the area. He's trying to isolate specific nerve pathways. With this setup and these needle-thin electrodes, you could make a finger twitch, a hand clench. You could make a dead man's hand play a chord on a piano if you knew what you were doing. The air left my lungs. A dead man's hand. He'd said it so casually, a simple technical hypothetical that was my entire reality. Why would someone build this? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Ben leaned back, crossing his arms. He looked at me, his gaze sharp and questioning. The friendly reunion was over. That's what I should be asking you, Leo. This is serious gear. The kind of thing you see in advanced neuroprosthetics labs or, well, the kind of thing a biohacker builds in his basement. It's elegant, but it's also dangerous as hell if you don't know what you're doing. So, I'll ask again. Where did you get this? I felt the walls closing in. My cover story about a personal project was dissolving under the heat of his expertise. I had to give him something, but not everything. "I found it," I said, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. "Clearing out an apartment for a family friend who passed away. He was an inventor, a recluse. I was just curious." Ben stared at me, his eyes searching my face. I could see the doubt, the calculation. He knew I wasn't telling him the whole truth, but he also saw the desperation. We hadn't been close friends, but there was a history there, a shared past in a brightly lit classroom dreaming of different futures. Finally, he sighed, breaking the tension. "Okay, Leo, a reclusive inventor. I'll buy that for $1." He shook his head, looking back at the schematics. "Whoever your friend was, he was brilliant, and maybe a little crazy. This thing is designed to make a body part move on its own with precision. Why he'd want to do that, that's beyond what the wires can tell me." He slid the notebook and the laptop back towards me. "My advice, be careful. People who build things like this are usually involved in things you don't want to be involved in." I nodded, my mind reeling. I had my answer. Finch wasn't the victim of a simple robbery. He was a brilliant, obsessive man who had built a machine to reanimate a piece of himself, and someone had killed him for it. I left Ben's shop with more than just a technical confirmation. I left with the chilling certainty that the moving finger wasn't the end of the mystery. It was the beginning. The drive back from Ben's shop was a blur of traffic lights and the rhythmic thump of windshield wipers against a persistent Chicago drizzle. The weight of the TENS unit's true purpose sat like a stone in Leo's gut. It wasn't just a theory anymore, it was a mechanism. A dead man's finger moved because Arthur Finch, a quiet book restorer, had engineered a way to make it move. The how was answered, but the why had become a chasm, dark and terrifyingly deep. Back in the sterile quiet of his apartment, the city lights painting soft-edged squares on his wall, Leo spread the contents of his clandestine investigation across his dining table. The photographs of the device, Ben's hastily drawn schematics, and most importantly, Finch's notebook. The notebook felt heavier now, its meticulous script no longer just the ramblings of an eccentric, but the research notes for an impossible project. He brewed a pot of coffee, the bitter aroma cutting through the stale air, and sat down. For hours, he immersed himself in Finch's world. The early pages were filled with dense, academic explorations of galvanic response and neuromuscular physiology. Finch quoted Luigi Galvani and Alessandro Volta, pioneers of bioelectricity, with the same reverence he likely reserved for master bookbinders. He documented his failures with cold precision. Test 3.4. Cascade failure in sequence B. Uncontrolled contraction in adjacent muscle groups. Amplitude too high. Refine pulse width. It was the detached language of a scientist. But as Leo pushed deeper into the notebook, the tone began to shift. Sprinkled between the technical data were more personal, philosophical entries. Frustration bled through the ink. October 12th. They dismiss it as a parlor trick, a twitch of dying nerves. They lack imagination. It is not about reanimation, but about legacy. A final, undeniable mark. A signature written after the author is gone. Who were they? Was this a project for an audience? Leo's fingers traced the page, the cheap paper feeling fragile. He found another entry, more revealing. November 3rd, Evie continues to be the most formidable skeptic. He called my theoretical work elegant but pointless. Pointless? Is a ship in a bottle pointless? Is a watch movement with 1,000 tiny pieces pointless? The point is the mastery itself. The point is to do what no one else can. I will show him. The final piece of the mechanism is almost complete. Evie, the initials stood out, stark against the page. Leo flipped backward and forward, scanning for any other mention. He found it 3 weeks earlier. Meeting with Elias Vance postponed. His patronage is essential, but his patience is thin. He sees only the result, not the beauty of the process. Elias Vance. The name echoed in the silent apartment. It was the first solid connection to another person, a potential patron. A skeptic Finch was desperate to impress. Leo moved from the table to his laptop. The coffee was long cold, but adrenaline had taken its place. His initial searches for Elias Vance Chicago yielded a ghost. There were no public-facing social media profiles, no LinkedIn pages. This was a man who deliberately stayed out of the light. Leo switched tactics, thinking like a man from Finch's world. He searched archives of art auctions, philanthropic donations, and architectural preservation societies. There, he found him. Elias Vance was a name that appeared quietly in the program notes for exclusive gallery openings and as a benefactor for the restoration of historical landmarks. He was old money, a reclusive collector of rare automata and horological masterpieces, intricate mechanical marvels. The connection clicked into place with an almost audible snap. Finch, the master of restoring delicate, old-world objects. Vance, the wealthy collector of them. It made perfect sense. They shared a passion for intricate, hidden mechanisms. Finch's project wasn't just about nerve stimulation. It was an attempt to create the ultimate automaton, one made of flesh and bone. But why was Finch dead? Did his project with Vance go wrong? Was Vance the they who dismissed his work, leading Finch to a desperate, fatal final experiment? Or was there a third party who wanted the technology for themselves? The questions multiplied, each more dangerous than the last. Leo knew he couldn't approach a man like Vance. He was a photographer, not a detective. He had no authority, no pretext. Trying to question a powerful recluse would be like a moth flying into a searchlight. He'd be noticed, and he'd be incinerated. Frustration gnawed at him. He stood up and paced the length of his small apartment, the city sprawling below him, indifferent. He had a name, a motive, a connection, but he had no proof. Nothing that linked Vance to the crime scene. Nothing he could take to Flores without revealing his own illegal entry and investigation, effectively ending his career and making him a suspect. He had to go back. The thought was immediate and terrifying. He had to go back to Finch's apartment. He must have missed something. A letter from Vance, a hidden schematic, a piece of correspondence tucked inside one of those ancient books. It was a reckless, stupid idea. The apartment was still an active crime scene, sealed. Breaking that seal was a felony. His phone buzzed on the table, the screen lighting up with a name that made his heart seize, D.E.T. Flores. He stared at it, his pulse hammering in his ears. Did she know? Had someone seen him? He forced himself to answer, his voice tight. Leah. Hey, her voice was tired, devoid of any suspicion. Just calling to see if you can take an extra shift Saturday. Miller's kid is sick. The sheer mundanity of the request was dizzying. He was standing in his apartment, unraveling a murder plot involving biomechanics and reclusive billionaires, and she was asking him about a shift change. Yeah, I can take it, he managed to say, his throat dry. Great. Thanks, Leo. And hey, she added, a flicker of something different in her tone, a touch of professional concern. Get some rest. You sounded a little wired the other night. Just a long week, he lied. I will. Good night, detective. He ended the call and leaned against the wall, his legs weak with relief and a fresh wave of dread. She was watching him, maybe not with suspicion, but with concern. One more misstep, and that concern would turn into something much sharper. But the call had also solidified his resolve. The official investigation was moving at a glacial pace, concerned with sick kids and shift changes. They would never find Elias Vance. They would never look inside Finch's books. He was the only one who could. An hour later, dressed in dark clothing, a small toolkit containing a tension wrench and a set of picks tucked into his jacket pocket, Leo stood across the street from Finch's Ravenswood apartment building. The drizzle had subsided, leaving the air cold and clean. The yellow police tape across the door, barely visible from his position, fluttered in the late-night breeze. He was a photographer, a documentarian. His job was to observe and record. But tonight, he was about to cross the line, to become a part of the scene itself. He took a deep breath and stepped out of the shadows, walking toward the door. The police tape was a flimsy, profane barrier against the quiet dignity of Arthur Finch's apartment. It sagged in the humid Chicago air, a yellow scar across the dark wood of the door. Leo stood in the hallway for a full minute, the tools in his pocket feeling heavy and alien. Every instinct, honed over 12 years of following rules, screamed at him to turn back. But the image of Finch's finger, that tiny, impossible twitch, was burned into his mind. It was a truth no one else would see, a story he was now compelled to finish. The lock was old, as he'd expected. His picks, bought online and practiced on a spare lock in his apartment until his fingers were sore, felt clumsy. The clicks of the tumblers were deafening in the silence. He froze at the sound of a door opening down the hall, his heart hammering against his ribs, but it was just a neighbor taking out the trash. He didn't look up. After what felt like an eternity, the deadbolt slid back with a dull, satisfying thud. Leo slipped inside, closing the door gently behind him, plunging the apartment into stillness. The air was thick and stale, a layered scent of old paper, leather, and the faint, coppery ghost of what had happened here. The forensic cleanup crew had been thorough, but they couldn't scrub the atmosphere. Dust motes danced in the slivers of moonlight, piercing the blinds. Leo didn't turn on a light. He used the small, powerful flashlight from his camera bag, its beam a scalpel dissecting the darkness. He moved with the quiet reverence he reserved for a crime scene, his feet instinctively avoiding the spots where he knew the bloodstains had been. He went straight to the desk. He ran his gloved fingers over its surface, searching for hidden drawers or false panels. Nothing. The filing cabinet was locked, but the lock was even simpler than the one on the door. He had it open in seconds. Inside were meticulously organized files, receipts for bookbinding supplies, tax records, insurance policies. All of it was painfully normal. He scanned the shelves of antique books, his light gliding over leather spines and gilt titles. The thought of searching everyone was daunting. Finch's notebook had mentioned a proposal. A proposal to a man like Elias Vance wouldn't be scribbled on a napkin. It would be formal, preserved. His eyes landed on a section of the bookshelf that seemed different. It held a row of identical, unadorned leather-bound volumes, not antiques but modern, custom-bound books. They looked like a private collection of journals. Leo pulled one out. It was heavy, filled with thick, creamy paper. He opened it. Blank, he tried the next one. Blank, the third, fourth, fifth, all empty. Frustration gnawed at him. He was wasting time. He was about to put the last one back when he noticed its weight. It felt subtly lighter than the others. He shook it gently. Nothing. He ran his fingers along the edge of the text block and felt it, a fine, almost invisible seam. Using his pocket knife, he carefully pried it open. The book was a lie. The interior had been hollowed out, a perfect, rectangular cavity carved into the pages, and inside lay a thin folio of papers. His heart leaped. He pulled the folio out, his flashlight beam trembling. The top page was a letter, typed on heavy stationery. "Mr. Vance," it began. It was Finch's proposal. He described his post-mortem signature, with an artist's passion and an engineer's precision, calling it the ultimate automaton, a final, defiant act of creation that blurred the line between mechanics and life. He laid out the science, the tens unit, the timers, the minute electrical charge needed to animate a single muscle after the brain was gone. Beneath it were Vance's replies. The first was typed on the same kind of stationery. The letterhead a simple, embossed V. Vance was intrigued, praising Finch's grotesque ingenuity. But the tone of the subsequent letters soured. Vance grew impatient, his language sharper. "The theoretical is tiresome, Mr. Finch. I require results, not philosophies." The final letter was different. It was on cheaper paper, the typing slightly askew, as if done in anger. "Your obsession has become a liability. Your continued correspondence on this matter is unwelcome and unwise. The project is terminated. This is my final communication. Do not attempt to contact me again." It wasn't a confession, but it was a motive. Finch, a proud and obsessive man, wouldn't have let it go. He would have pushed, threatened to expose Vance's bizarre patronage. And Vance, a reclusive billionaire who valued his privacy above all else, would have seen only one way to guarantee Finch's silence. The robbery was a fabrication, a crude stage play to cover the real performance. Leo didn't take the letters. He was a photographer. He documented. He pulled out his own camera, the one he always carried, and set up the shot. No flash. He used his flashlight, painting the documents with light, just as he would an evidence marker. He bracketed his exposures, capturing every word, every fiber of the paper. He photographed the hollowed-out book, the letters inside, then each letter individually, front and back. Crisp, clear, undeniable proof. With the images secured on his memory card, he carefully replaced everything, sliding the hollow book back into its place on the shelf. The apartment looked exactly as he'd found it. He slipped out, locking the door behind him, the mechanism clicking softly into place. He walked away without looking back, melting into the late-night anonymity of the Ravenswood streets. Back in his own apartment, the city lights of Chicago a distant, glittering web, Leo felt the full weight of what he'd done. He had proof that could ruin a powerful man, but it was fruit of a poisoned tree, obtained illegally. Handing it to Flores would mean admitting to breaking and entering, a career-ending confession that would likely invalidate the evidence anyway. Vance's lawyers would shred him, but doing nothing felt like a betrayal of Arthur Finch and of the truth itself. He looked at his camera. For years, it had been a shield, a way to observe the world's horrors from a safe distance. Tonight, it had been his weapon and his key. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't be the accuser, but he could be the messenger. He spent the next hour in his darkroom, not the digital one, but the old, chemical one he rarely used anymore. He printed the photographs of the letters onto high-quality archival paper. The images were stark and irrefutable. He then printed a single photo from the crime scene, the close-up of Finch's hand, the one that showed the finger in its final, moved position. He put the prints into a plain manila envelope. He added no note, no explanation. The pictures told the entire story for anyone willing to look. They started with a consequence, a moved finger, and ended with a cause, a threatening letter. It was a perfect, self-contained narrative. The next morning, wearing gloves, he drove to a post office in a suburb miles from his neighborhood. He placed the envelope into a blue USPS mailbox, the metal door clanging shut with a note of finality. He addressed it simply to Detective Izzy Flores, Area 3 Violent Crimes. As he drove away, he didn't feel triumph, only a quiet, profound sense of release. He had balanced the scales in the only way he knew how. He had taken a perfect picture, one that told the whole truth. Whether Flores would develop, it was out of his hands. The Chicago skyline rose before him, solid and real against the morning sky. He was just a photographer again, an observer. But he knew, with absolute certainty, that he would never look at a crime scene the same way again.